Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
It was a network of safe houses that helped slaves in America escape the brutality of the South. But in the author Colson Whitehead's latest novel, the Underground Railroad takes on physical form. A steam train delivering runaways through secret tunnels to the safety of the North. His magical realist take on one girl's struggle for freedom has won him a plethora of awards and accolades, not least from Barack Obama. I spoke to him earlier today about the pertinence of his story in modern America, a week after right-wing protests in Charlottesville over plans to pull down a statue of a Confederate general. President Trump, of course, was criticised by left and right for saying there were fine people among them, though he did say racism was evil and white supremacists were repugnant.
About 17 years ago, I came across a reference to the Underground Railroad, and if you don't know how it actually worked, it was a system of people who helped slaves escape from the slave states to the north, black people, white people, and they would rend material aid. And when you're a kid and you first hear about it, you envision a literal subway beneath the earth, an underground railroad. And then your teacher explains how it actually worked, and you're sort of sad. I thought, well, what if it actually was a literal train taking slaves north, which is sort of fantastic. And then I added the element that each state our hero goes through as she moves north is a different state of American possibility. And so North Carolina has its own system, South Carolina, and that was the idea.
How important is it to bring something new to the slavery story?
I expect something different. I didn't want to have the same sort of plantation tale I'd seen before. If you're writing in 2015, we know about trauma and psychological stress, what it does to slaves. And so in order to make a plantation that was realistic for me, writing a few years ago, I had to update it. And so I think if you write about slavery in 1950 or 1980 or now, you're bringing your own sort of cultural perceptions to it. And that's what I was doing.
I mean, the current context to think about this novel in America and everything that's happened in Charlottesville and elsewhere is very striking. How do you feel your story sits in where America is today?
Well, you know, if you write about race in 1850, where the book takes place, you're writing about race now. And so there's a lot of stuff in the book about imperialism, white supremacy, and of course those dominated American politics and laws for a very long time. And then we've just had an election where we've elected a white supremacist again, who's fulfilling his sort of dreams of a white supremacist nation. And so things have changed a lot, obviously, since 1850, but a lot of things haven't changed. And so we've gone back to a very conservative and, I think, dehumanizing way of looking at the world.
I mean, that's a very shocking thing for you to say about Donald Trump. I mean, he would obviously deny that. Why do you put it in those terms?
Well, I mean, it's not hard to, go back to even the start of his campaign and find his anti-Muslim, anti-black, xenophobic rhetoric. His comments in the late 80s about the Central Park Five kids who were wrongly accused of a gang rape. And he took out an ad saying that they should be put to death and never apologized when they were exonerated. So he's a very specific way of looking at the world. And now he has license in his sort of older years to execute it.
Were you shocked at the extent, it seemed, of white supremacists in America when you saw those pictures?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's been the sort of base facts of America since the beginning. We start with eradicating the Native Americans, stealing their land, enslaving Africans in order to make the country into an economic viable powerhouse. And so that American darkness is there from the beginning. It's there now. It's always waiting. You can look to Obama's election as a time of an expression of progressive energies. But of course, he only got like 51 or 52% of the population to vote for him.
Are you hopeful about the future, or do you think things are getting worse?
I have to be hopeful. I have kids, and I have to hope that they're going to be growing up in a world that's better than the one I grew up in. And if I look back at my grandparents' generation, my parents' generation, they couldn't conceive of all the sort of progress we've made. And so we go a little forward, we go a little back. I think we're sort of a dumb kind of species, and we don't move forward as quickly as we can, or should. But you have to have hope, or else there's no point in, well, there's no point. So.
I mean, are you hopeful after the latest round of sort of departures from the White House, including Steve Bannon?
It's chaos, but his campaign was chaos. The first few months of his administration's been chaos. Most people are pretty numb to it, and we wonder when it will end or how it will end.
That's dangerous, isn't it? I mean, being numb to it is a really dangerous thing, isn't it? Because you can sort of ignore it.
Well, there's certain things like that are out of our control. A Republican-dominated government. He's not going to be impeached anytime soon because they haven't turned on him, and so we can express our ideas, we can express our anger, but a lot of different events will have to take place before things change.
Colson Whitehead talking to me earlier.
When is it appropriate to remove statues from our streets and squares and parks erected to men whose past glories are now an embarrassment to many? When the city of Charlottesville voted to remove a statue of General Robert E. Lee, who commanded the Confederate Army of North Virginia, the ensuing furore saw KKK, white supremacists and neo-Nazis in the streets, violent clashes with counter-demonstrators, the death of one young woman, and opprobrium heaped on Donald Trump for his failure to condemn the actions of far-right groups. In Russia is the 80th anniversary of the Great Terror, the purges in which Joseph Stalin killed and enslaved millions, and yet new statues to him are springing up in the country, led by Vladimir Putin's admiration of the dictator for his role in crushing the Nazis. In a moment, we'll be discussing what to do with fallen idols and how they speak to history now. But first, here's a views night on the subject from Dr. Rahul Rao from SOAS, University of London.
Statues are more about our present than our past. Is the statue of Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville a symbol of oppression to be torn down, or a historical monument to be preserved? Donald Trump laments America's history being torn apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments. But controversies about statues aren't mainly about the past. They're almost always about the present. The statue in Charlottesville wasn't built soon after the US Civil War, but in 1924. Most Confederate monuments were built in two periods. First, from 1900 to 1920, when Southern states were enacting Jim Crow laws to segregate public space. Second, in the 1950s and 60s, when white supremacists were fighting desegregation and the civil rights movement. At both times, statue building reasserted white dominance in the present. Statues and flags in public spaces like government buildings, schools, and parks claim to represent the community. But celebrating symbols of slavery excludes and marginalizes the descendants of the enslaved. Donald Trump asks incredulously if the next step would be to take down statues of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. He thinks it would be self-evidently absurd to topple the nation's founding fathers. But maybe this is exactly what is needed to reimagine American identity in non-racist ways. This is what South African protesters have been doing to the father figure of apartheid, Cecil Rhodes, in part by bringing down a statue. In India, historically oppressed Dalits have been building statues of B.R. Ambedkar, the great Dalit leader and architect of the Indian Constitution. They do this as a way of reclaiming space from which they've been excluded. If we truly want equality in our present, we need to be honest about our past. Tearing down and building up can both be steps towards justice.
And Rahul joins me now, as does historian Tim Stanley. Good evening to you both. Let's have a conversation about how you decide all this. Tim Stanley, Rahul suggested in his piece there that actually in order to remake American identity, it's possible to consider bringing down the statues of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
I admire him for his honesty and his logic. because a lot of people would say they want to stop at one set of statues. They may well do, but once you open this conversation, once you approach the subject from the principle of let us eradicate those things from the past that were morally wrong and are unacceptable today, then you cannot stop, indeed, at Confederate statues. You put everything on the table. And the problem with that is you end up creating quite an artificial sense of what the past was. You try to cleanse it of all things that make no sense morally to us today, and therefore you rewrite people's past, and you create a past which simply wasn't real. You're rewriting the past.
Not at all. I think a lot of these movements that are objecting to statues aren't about rewriting the past at all. The rash of Confederate monuments that scars the American landscape were themselves exercises in revisionist history. They were built to sort of nurture this view of the Civil War as a noble struggle fought against Northern aggression. So removing those statues actually helps us write a better history of the Civil War.
Well, looking back at the Second World War, for example, Tim Stanley, and indeed looking at the Spanish Civil War, are you against the removal, as has been done, of statues of Franco to private places, the statues of Mussolini to private places, and so on?
No, it's about contemporary culture and context, and it must be a legal process, not one driven by a mob or a particular interest group. So, for instance, Ukraine right now is removing statues of Lenin. That makes sense to me. But, by contrast, consider Parliament Square, because we're all focused on Big Ben today. Who is in Parliament Square? Well, on the one hand, you have Winston Churchill and Jan Smuts, architects of empire, men with really very bigoted and unpleasant views. But in Parliament Square, you also have Nelson Mandela. And that's the point. Statues tell a full story. History doesn't start in leaps and bounds. It's an evolution. And if you keep all the statues, Winston Churchill, Jan Smuts and Nelson Mandela, you then have a full history of empire for people to read. You can't remove everything. You can't obliterate history.
It's not about obliterating at all. I think the aesthetics of celebration are very different from the aesthetics of critique. It would be one thing to put these statues in a museum where they're brought into conversation with dissenting views from the same time. It's quite another thing to put them up on a pedestal, quite literally in a public place.
But where do you stop? But where do you stop with that? I mean, I could say that actually you wouldn't want a lot of statues of 19th century politicians because they stood against the suffrage for women. I mean, so would you agree with that?
I don't think any historical figure should be beyond re-evaluation and examination.
But does that mean removal?
Why? As I was saying earlier, it could mean replacing those statues in a museum.
But if you put them in private, places, you don't have a dialogue.
They don't have to be private.
But why would you bother to put them in a museum? Why not just melt them down? Precisely. If these people are so fundamentally immoral, why not just get rid of the statue altogether?
Precisely because we don't want to forget the history. Right. The objective is not to erase, is not to obscure, it is to expose. So, for example, the renaming of Robert E. Lee Park as Emancipation Park actually tells that history better. Yeah. It tells us a history that doesn't glorify the slaver, but actually records the struggles of people who were enslaved and the way in which that struggle was resolved.
You see, that particular one aside, because that's a very particular contemporary context, my fear is a lot of the effort to take statues down isn't about correcting history so much as telling a particular political kind of history.
Let's take another. What about the question of Oliver Cromwell? Would you leave Oliver Cromwell's statue up, or would you take it down?
I'm not sure why that's the specific example you're getting at.
Well, I think it's a specific example because one section of the community, he was an absolute tyrant.
Yes.
And is actually remembered as a tyrant. Another section of the community is not. So when you have a divide, how do you decide?
When putting up the statue of Cromwell outside Parliament was debated in 1895, it nearly brought the government down. It was such a controversial statue. Now, I'm a Catholic. I have some Irish in my family. To me, Cromwell is one thing and one thing only, a war criminal who actually shut Parliament down. But 100 years on from that statue being erected, I understand that it's part of British identity, rightly or wrongly, and sometimes we do lie to ourselves, we do tell national fantasies. It's part of our identity that Cromwell stood up for parliamentary sovereignty. That's why the statue's there.
Well, talking about fantasy, let's just talk for a second before we go about Russia, because, you know, Vladimir Putin seems hell-bent on rehabilitating Joseph Stalin. Well, what do you make of that? I mean, the idea now that people in Russia are going to look and see the man who murdered their ancestors put in a pedestal.
I think we're talking about all of these different examples as if they were equivalent. I think we need to make a distinction between situations where those in power build statues to kind of ratify their stranglehold on the public sphere, and marginalized, oppressed groups wanting to put up statues as a way of getting a toehold into a public sphere from which they've been excluded. I think those are not morally equivalent situations at all.
Thank you both very much indeed.
I've been getting away with it.